Good evening. We're back. The Biblical Rogues Gallery is back from holiday vacation, and Amber is sick. You are currently watching the Biblical Rogues Gallery on Trinity Radio when Deep Calls Deep and the Church Split, but primarily Trinity Radio because we're the host channel with the best bumper music in the business.
That's a lie.
No, it's not a lie. Braxton picks the best music. You have that dad rock. What do you call it? That like D-lister new metal dad rock stuff. And one of the things that I want to make known is in the mid 90s to early 2000s, I was a new metal fan. I listened to it, and guess what? It's garbage. It doesn't hold up. It was always garbage, and I didn't know better. Just had to get that out there. And by the way, same deal with grunge. Grunge does not hold up.
What's it like to always have such trash opinions?
Feels good because nobody will like you, and then I don't have to be friends with anybody. It's great.
Well, it's working, that's for sure.
Exactly.
I'm already delete your number.
Derek, how are you doing?
I am doing well, enjoying and I say that sarcastically, the frigid, cold. Gosh, it got a high of like 22 today, and we got like 18 inches of snow last week, and it's awful.
I hear
but
you.
Other than that, I've been good.
I got to work at home all last week, so I never left the house. Today, coming to work this morning was the first time I left the house since getting home from work a week ago Friday. And I stayed home Saturday, Sunday, all week, all this past weekend. And guess what? My wife and I know that y'all are all here this is Biblical Rogues Gallery. We blather, get over it. Go watch Braxton's videos. You don't blather. But my wife and I, while we're snowed in, we've been watching Moonlighting. It's on Tubi. It's free because we don't pay for subscription channels. And Moonlighting, if you want to see why Bruce Willis became the star that he became, go watch Moonlighting. It is the best 80s show ever. It's fantastic. Anyway,
look into that. But I will say this because we're talking about, because I work from home, that's fine. But it was the first week, sometime in the first week, like before the snow fell of this year. And I went out for a run. I was like, first run of the year. I went 12 miles. I felt so good because I was like, I'm going to do 10, but I ended up doing 12 because I felt so good. I'm like, this is going to be a good year running. And then the snow comes and I didn't run for like 9 days straight because I would have been like, slipping all over the roads. And so I finally got a run yesterday. And
well, count your blessings because running is stupid.
That's why I had to throw that in there. I was like,
and I have to comment that
you'll feel sorry for me.
Walking is the best cardio, but even better than that is my little pedal station, so I don't even have to go outside.
I have
Amber, your mic is muted, but I want to know how you're doing.
Oh, sorry. Besides being a little under the weather, I'm actually doing really, really well. School started today, and I have this semester 2 of the easiest classes I've had in my entire college and graduate seminary career. So it's going to be nice to do some stuff that doesn't require a lot of thinking. So that'll be fun. And everything else is just really going really well. Life is good. Everybody's good. Everybody's happy. And we're just falling into a good rhythm, I think, in a good season. So I'm really looking forward to this year.
And Wes from the Church Split, how are you doing, sir?
Doing good, man. It feels good to be back after we got our little ice storm, and my first time dealing with an ice storm down here in southern Indiana. I giggled a lot being from the tundra. So, but it was kind of nice that they shut everything down, and it just meant work from home and chill. So my Christmas break was extended.
And you got your floors done. You sent me a video. For those who don't know, Will had me come and help him destroy his old floor. And it came up pretty easy until we discovered that the previous homeowner was lazy and left linoleum tile underneath the floor that they had. which meant it wasn't level with the rest of the floor. And Will was almost just going to be lazy and not take that up because it was glued, it was nailed, it was stapled. They did everything they could to keep that crappy linoleum. But
I didn't want it to go nowhere. They wanted it to stay really badly.
And it was ugly. And I insisted that we do so what could have been done in an hour took us like 9. But
we were sore for days. But now I got my new flooring and it looks amazing.
It looks amazing. It's they did a great job. I do the demo. I don't lay the floors. Anyway, let's get into Romans chapter 11. We're going to be talking about a text that gets a lot of attention, especially if you're into the eternal security debate. Just to lay my cards out, me personally, I'm not a once saved, always saved kind of person, but Will is going to challenge me tonight to convince me that this is still a decent proof text for the conditional security position, because I'm not sold on this being this is not the text that I would go to for conditional security.
I mean, I would go here for as my proof text. I would say that it's like an additional bolstering, not like the main one I'd go to.
No, sure. But I'm saying I probably wouldn't bother with it at all, except that it does create a problem for our once saved, always saved, perseverance of the saints, all of those people. If they agree with me, that's fine, but then they'll create themselves a problem with how they exegete other texts. So we'll get into all of that, but that's really not the main thrust. It's just what Braxton puts on the thumbnail to get all of you people here. We're going to actually talk about all of this passage. There's actually some debates in the commentaries about, is this one pericope? Is it 2? Is it up to 4 different things? Should we not be taking such a big chunk out of this? But I think the majority has it right. This is, 1 through 10 is a pretty solid section. The fact that verse 11 picks up with the rhetorical question again and kind of that diatribe format shows that he's starting a new section, but it's still connected to the previous section. And I think going all the way through verse 24 is the way to go with this. So I think the commentaries are pretty right on with that. So we're gonna follow that. And we're gonna take this whole section as one chunk, though there are arguments to be made that you could divide it up a little bit more. So who's gonna read for us tonight? Anyone volunteering before I have to?
Amber looks like she's really desperate to read right now.
She's like hacking.
I'll do it.
I'll
do it.
Good job, Derek.
I've been avoiding it for probably months at this point, but
yeah. Well, Amber is sick, and I sound like a redneck from Arkansas. So
it's because you are, but
that whoopee.
Yeah, it's new year, new me, so I'm not shirking responsibility anymore.
Good. Read.
All right. Romans 11, starting in verse 11. I say then, they did not stumble so as to fall, did they? Far from it. But by their wrongdoing, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous. Now, if their wrongdoing proves to be riches for the world, and their failure riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their fulfillment be? But I am speaking to you who are Gentiles. Therefore, insofar as I am an apostle of Gentiles, I magnify my ministry if somehow I may move my own people to jealousy and save some of them. For if their rejection proves to be the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? If the first piece of dough is holy, the lump is also, and if the root is holy, the branches are as well. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them and became partaker with them of the rich root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. But if you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. Quite right. They were broken off for their unbelief, but you stand by your faith. Do not be conceited, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. See then the kindness and severity of God. To those who fell, severity, but to you, God's kindness. If you continue in his kindness, for otherwise you too will be cut off. I read that weird. I'm sorry. And they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and contrary to nature were grafted into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who are the natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? Sorry, those semicolons were really throwing me off.
Yeah, well, if you read it weird, it's okay because the NASB translates it kind of weird. So we'll just let that one sit.
Another reason to use a different one. Just
well,
saying.
I hear you, Nick. Yeah, we voted at the beginning of this that, when we start a new book for the Biblical Rose Gallery, we'll do another poll and see what other translations the audience wants us to use. But they picked this one, so we're gonna give the people what they want, because we use the
we
Nick
believe in
Quint
democracy.
version anyway, right? Whenever you're here, so it doesn't really matter.
Democracy.
So I have some thoughts about this, and one of the things that I wanted to start with before we get into the verse by verse, or the break it down a little bit further. Paul, I like to pick on Paul, and so I'm going to play the moderate to liberal guy, even though I'm not a moderate or liberal guy. But one of the things that I've noticed that they point out here is something that I actually noticed too, and that's where Paul says, well, he's arguing that, well, the Jews are doing bad things, but guess what? That's blessings for you, right? That means it's good news for you. And if it's good news for you, well, when they come back around, it's going to be even better news, right? But there's still implicitly in here the statement where Paul's saying that the Jews' unbelief means riches for the Gentiles, good for the world, right? But that's kind of like the argument that Paul was rebuking in Romans chapter 3. Because the slanderous Jews were accusing Paul of saying, well, if the Jews are doing bad, let us do bad, because it's going to be even good stuff will result from it. In chapter 3, verses 5 through 9. So why was Paul, how do y'all work that out? I mean, I've worked it out because I'm not, picking on Paul like the moderate and liberal type scholars. Nick, this is your world. You hang out with people like that. I've worked this out. I don't know if y'all have noticed that, but Paul was jumping down on the well, if our sin highlights God's righteousness, and if we do, let us do evil so good will come of it. And then Paul in chapter 11 seems to be saying, well, the Jews are doing bad, but good for the Gentiles is going to come from it. Kind of a weird thing there. And, I just wanted to figure I'd mention it because, sometimes, us conservatives, we live in our conservative evangelical Christian confessional, inerrancy world. And a lot of people don't really know that other people start picking on Paul a lot more than even I do. So what do you make of that? Paul says it's bad if you do it, but I'm going to do it here.
Yep.
It's one of those things. What I think, since y'all didn't know that I was going to throw that at y'all, and since y'all are terrible apologists and are sitting in silence.
Oh, sorry, I'm trolling the chat.
And I'm waiting for you to make an actual point of substance. So continue.
Oh,
Never.
I missed you, Pritchett. Sorry, I had to get that one out. I've been
get out.
Well,
Hey,
my
let's wait till
response,
we get to the Old Testament stuff,
my response to those who are picking on Paul here is, number one, sin is bad. So Paul has every right to rebuke Jews who are claiming that his gospel is do bad so that we can do good, because that's not what Paul's claiming.
Yeah, he's not a theistic determinist. Yeah, he's not approving sin because better things would come. And so when people slander Paul with that, as they say, as we are slanderous, golly, you're right. The NASB, just as we are slanderously reported, and as some claim that we say, let us do evil that good may come of it. Well, their condemnation is deserved. Paul is right to say that, because Paul is saying this is the way it is. He's not saying that this is a good thing that it is. He's just merely saying this is the way that it is in Romans chapter 11. But if you are going to sin, your justification for sin can't be because God's going to do good stuff if I do bad stuff. So I think he's right in chapter 3 to shoot that down, and right in chapter 11 that, well, God's going to make lemonade out of this lemon. That's how I work it out, but I could be,
I mean, God has been if that's the case, then God's been a pretty good bartender since the beginning of time, making all sorts of things out of human failure. Sounds like what we talked about in Romans 9 and Romans 1 and Romans 3.
Well, in Romans 8:28,
Romans 7, Romans 6, Romans 5, those chapters before.
Yeah. But I did think that was interesting that people were calling, they were calling Paul out on that. They were like, well, Paul is saying that's bad, but then he argues similarly. But I don't think that that's what he's doing. I think he's saying, yeah, don't use sin as an excuse that's just you're slandering what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying, whatever, in chapter 3. But in chapter 11, he is saying, in light of the fact that the Jews are doing bad, God's going to use that for good. And that's a different thing than saying we should do bad so that God will do good. Those are not the same thing. So I get it, why that they would point that out, and I wanted to bring it up so that nobody can accuse the biblical rogues gallery of ducking liberal scholarship or whatever. But I don't think that those two are the same thing.
Liberal scholarship is just not something you need to acknowledge too much. They're not good.
Well, I agree, but but I did want to point out, I do think that that's kind of interesting. That I can see where I can see where you would get that though, because he is kind of, because he kind of has to say that, right? I mean, he does have to say, no, you're not supposed to do bad so that good will be even better, and God will bring good at it. But you also have to say, well, Israel is rejecting their Messiah, but that still can be used as good news for Gentiles. So
right. Well, I mean, that seems to be exactly what it is. I mean, not that sin is bad, like sin is suddenly a good thing. Like Nick said, he's not a theological determinist, but God can. The way I like to put it is that God redeems from evil. Like, so he redeems good out of evil. So even though Israel did evilly and they rejected Messiah, does not mean that that's good, but God is able to use it for good by extending it to the Gentiles and provoking the Jews unto jealousy.
Mm-hmm. And didn't Paul say somewhere previously, like mention something about what we are accused of teaching, so he might be kind of covering himself again to certain accusations.
Yeah, the charge of libertinism as a mask for actual freedom.
Mm.
Yeah, well, that's really, he's kind of headed there in 14 and 15 with the weak and the strong anyway. He's got to deal with those issues.
Yeah, he's got to deal with the deacon board in chapters 12 through 15.
The deacon board. The only
Those
deacon
who know. Those who
the
know,
only
know.
deacon in Romans is Phoebe.
Yeah, she's the boss of that, but she's still got to get these people in line. So he's just got to encourage her a little bit.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So this is verse 11. We're getting back into another rhetorical question. He's getting back in the diatribe mode, and of course, this is I think this is the last. May it never be. Make it known to a kind of firm statement in the book. He's said it several times in the previous 10 chapters, but I think this is the last time he has that forceful thing where he responds to, did they stumble so as to fall? Did they and he says, no, may it never be, far from it. However you want to translate that. No. So he's setting up this idea that just because Israel is kind of, at least those that are not part of the remnant are on the outs, that doesn't mean that they are too far gone. And that's pretty much setting up his whole rest of this, right? That you can't discount what God is going to do for unbelieving Israel, because there's still a purpose for them in God's plan. And of course, we know where that goes because we've all read the rest of the chapter. But next week we get into what does it mean for all Israel to be saved. That'll be a lot of fun. But for now, he's basically saying you cannot write them off. And I think to the majority Gentile audience, that's an important point to make at this juncture, because he's about to address some of the potential haughtiness or arrogance or whatever that's coming in the section here that we're going to cover tonight. But what's interesting is this translation of far from it, by their wrongdoing, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous. And some commentators, Jewett particularly, calls into question translating that as jealous. And he thinks a better translation would be something more along the lines of zealotry or zealous anger. And
that's actually what it's a compound verb, parazeleo, but zeleo does look related to fervency or zealotry or eagerness or something like that. So yeah, that's something I noticed immediately.
So, and his argument, I think, is a good one, because he's like, unbelieving Israel considers Jewish believers in Jesus to be apostate heretics. So given that, why would they be jealous of apostate heretics?
Well, because God, it seems to be blessing them. Like the amount that Jesus movement took off alone seemed to be something that they would be provoked to jealousy, because since Judaism was essentially still stuck in Israel and Christianity started kind of really exploding, it just seems like it'd be something that would provoke unto jealousy due to the blessing that's upon them, because they're starting to see the same blessing that Israel received over this Jesus movement.
Yeah. Well, what was that word, Nick, you were saying that's related to zealotry?
It's the compound verb there. It's para plus zelao. It occurs. So actually, I'll look it up. Give me what size. So it occurs. Eight times in Romans, or 8 times. Let me see. So Romans 10:19. I'll make you jealous. Those who are not a nation. With a foolish nation, I'll make you. Then, of course, Romans here in 11. But 1 Corinthians 10:22. Should we provoke the Lord to jealousy, or something? Or however you rent, or make him envious, or arouse indignation, or
the indignation.
Yeah.
Because what I thought was interesting is it's a drop the para. It's a compound word here, but it's kind of the similar language to Acts 13, where the crowd, and it's translated in Acts 13, jealousy as well. But it seems like indignation or zealous anger or something like that would probably be more fitting, because I don't know, because to your point, Will, the temple is still standing, right? Mm-hmm. At this point in Romans. So I don't know that they would actually they would be jealous of the movement so much as they would be angry with it, in the same way that Paul himself was. And well,
that's why I say I think it provokes them onto it. Like, not saying that this is immediate right now, but as this goes on, I don't see anything in the text that says it's like it has to happen right now, as in it's going to happen.
You also have, just as a parallel to that, if we want a biblical example, this is the parable of the prodigal son. And he comes back home, and what does the older brother do? Throws a hissy fit at the blessing.
Yeah.
Undeserved, and he's indignant at all of that. So there's that element, perhaps.
So do you think all right, so you're not with Jewett? You don't think that's a bad, you think jealousy is a fair translation of that?
No, I think it has a denotation of more of a moral indignation. Like being not like jealous in the sense of not getting what you want, but
how would you translate it? Emulation, indignation, or jealousy?
I wouldn't go with jealousy. Indignation is probably closer, but I'm not sure. I'm not quite certain.
Yeah.
But there's also an irony a little bit to like the indignation and irritation that they had toward Christianity, since it was actually the Jews for so long that had so much indignation to them from the foreign nations. So it's kind of ironic that they flipped around and started doing it too. You're shaking your head, Amber. What's your thoughts?
Well, when we get into, I think 16 is important here in looking at this, because there's comparing the piece of dough is holy, the lump is holy. If the root is holy, the branches are holy as well. That dough and lump imagery goes back to the first fruits offerings that come from the blessing of the overflow of following the covenant and being God's chosen people. And so if that has been now transferred to all believers, that's not just exclusively a Jewish thing to benefit from the overflow that you have this blessing to give back. That's now been transferred to everybody. And so that's going to provoke a response in people who understand covenant overflow and blessing and offerings and giving those back. And I think there's a piece of that involved in this as well.
Oh, there's definitely that. I was saving that discussion for a little bit here later, because we're not at verse 16 yet, Amber.
Yeah. Well, she likes anything that can reference the Old Testament. That's all she cares about.
I know, that's fair.
Well,
That's right.
If you actually go back,
and I get it. Anything that's not Paul, I'm excited about, but this Paul stuff. No.
Well, if you go back and look at that verb in the Septuagint, it looks like it appears already in a place Paul has already cited, the Deuteronomy 32:21. Being provoked by idolatry, So that sense, it would be more, and God is the agent speaking. So in the sense of God being provoked by, well, it's hard to explain, but it's almost as if you are being intentionally antagonized. So maybe antagonistic, trolling. Obviously those are not quite what Paul has in mind, but that sort of idea. And Judah in 1 Kings 14:22, and Judah did was evil in the sight of the Lord, and they provoked him to jealousy. So the idea that God being annoyed at transgressions and sin and stuff like that. And then you have the Psalms and stuff like that. But Deuteronomy 32 seems to be probably the closest intertext there.
Yeah. Jewett's case was, if you translate it more like anger or indignation or something like that, he says Paul could see, because Paul doesn't really give us God's plan. He's in detail. He just kind of gives us this idea that, well, whatever they're provoked by, God's going to use that to also save some of them or whatever. So he doesn't really say how that's going to happen. But what Jewett was thinking was, if we don't translate that jealousy and more something along the lines of indignation, Paul could have in mind his own conversion, where he was provoked to anger towards the church. And then he had his Damascus Road experience. And he's thinking something similar might happen as Gentiles are coming to a saving faith in Jesus, that they may have an experience like Paul had. And I think there
Paul
might
didn't convert, so
Paul
didn't convert, so there's that too.
Well, that's a whole other debate of, was it a calling or a conversion or both? And I'm with the both and, but we can have that debate later.
Well, here's a point.
When we do Biblical Roads Gallery on Acts or Galatians or wherever
we need to keep it short. Maybe we'll do 1 Peter and 2 Peter there. We'll make it easy for Pritchett. He can be, we'll speak his love language. But real quick, I was curious. Trespass in verses 11 and 12, and of course, it's used all over. It's in the singular there. Their trespass. What is the trespass? Because trespass is not the same as sin. Sin and trespass are not identical. So what would trespass? I mean, trespass can involve sin, but trespass is not identical to sin. For example, Pritchett will know what I'm saying when morphe to theou in Philippians 2, right? And people go, oh, Paul means something like image, so icon, right? In Genesis 1, and they develop an incipient Adam Christology from that. But that's morphe and icon are not identical terms. Form is not the same as image. So I'm wondering if there's significance, one, to it being singular, and also two, to his use of trespass or transgression or stepping out or whatever you want to call it versus sin.
Yeah, well, what I think Paul has in mind here in verses 11 and 12 with trespass what I think he has in mind is out of step with the new covenant. So what he's saying is they're wrong. Whatever it is, he has in mind the singular idea of rejection of the Messiah.
So we would say something along the lines, and I'm being intentionally snarky, their Christology is not high enough.
Yeah. So by their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles. So because on account of their rejection, and this, I mean, we see this in real time. Like I say, if you go back to Acts chapter 13, there's similar language here and there too. Different authors, of course, but I mean, Luke seems to be using this kind of language. And of course, Paul talks about how he turns to the Gentiles because the Jews viewed themselves unworthy of eternal life. So, he's making that same point here. And it's the same language as far as provoking them to, Luke talks about how the response to Paul there in Acts 13, they were jealous or indignant, however you want to translate it, it's the same Greek. So, I mean, it's talking about that response. And so we've seen this. We know what's going on here. There's something about the rejection of the Jews means they're going to bring forth the mission and focus on, or at least Paul, because he says, insofar later on in this passage, insofar as I'm the apostle to the Gentiles, doesn't mean he doesn't talk to Jews as well and witness to them. But he's saying, insofar as that, he's taking this to the Gentiles, and whatever it is, this trespass, this rejection of the Messiah, verse 12, proves to be riches for the world, and their failure riches for the Gentiles. How much more will their fulfillment be? So he's already setting up what he's going to get into next week about, God's desire to have mercy on all, right? So he's saying there's a thing right now they've rejected, but if their rejection is good news for the Gentiles' inclusion, how much more will the Jewish inclusion be when that happens? So he's kind of already setting that up in verse 12. So,
well, and besides 3 uses in Matthew and Mark, that word for trespass seems to be distinctly Pauline elsewhere in the New Testament.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Ephesians 2:1, you are dead in your trespasses and your sins.
Yeah.
So that's interesting too.
I got really interested in Nick's connection there with Deuteronomy 32, so I went and looked that up. And most of those references were that provoked idea. In Hebrew, that's what it's called, a hipfil, which is to cause an action. So someone would cause an action to happen, except Deuteronomy 32:21, which is in the PL, which that is going to be a thing that is going to cause a state of being. So there's both of those imageries of causing a state and also causing a reaction simultaneously in that chapter in 32 there, which that really kind of makes an interesting, to me at least, the idea of provoking jealousy or provoking whatever you're playing with there. Is it, if you're pulling from Deuteronomy 32, are you pulling out the PL, or it's a state that's being caused, or if it's an actual reaction that's being caused there? I don't know.
It's in the PL. That's actually really fascinating. I didn't realize that. So if it's in that,
one of them is, one reference is in PL. The rest of them are in hipfil. So
clear as mud.
That's what Hebrew does. Hebrew is clear as mud sometimes.
There you go. But he's got this lesser to greater idea about, well, Jewish rejection, good news for Gentiles, but how much greater would Jewish acceptance be if it's already good for Gentiles? So in verse 13, this is where, and it's interesting because we talked to Dr. David Allen on our Trinity Radio broadcast about his, two audience idea about the first part being written. Yeah, I know. Being written to read the book. It's an idea. We entertain ideas. I'm not sold on it either, but we entertain ideas. And I want to have him on this program eventually to talk about it.
I'm supposed to have him on talking about that book too. I read it and I made the similar sound to Nick, but I'm also not bothered by ideas either. So
I mean,
what is it like? I'm not bothered by ideas either. I just think it was a bad idea. You're allowed to believe bad things.
But in 13, he's explicitly calling out, I am speaking to you who are Gentiles. Insofar as I am the apostle of Gentiles, I magnify my ministry. Somehow I move my own people to jealousy. And save some of them. Paul, again, thinking he's Jesus saving people, just like in 1 Corinthians 9, so that I might save some, He's a very, very bad Reformed theologian thinking that he can save people, but I'm kidding. Anyway,
like a based Baptist, if you ask me.
I may move my own people and save them. Okay. Anyway, that's that same language. I become all things to all people so that I might save some. He thinks he's the savior.
What a synergist.
I know Paul's so awful. Well, no, he thinks he's Jesus. He thinks he has the power.
Oh, you took it.
He does have Christ living in him. So
yeah, I know. I mean, he's not as bad as Peter the Pelagian who says, "Save yourselves" in Acts. So but we're kidding, everybody. Some of you are new to this show. We're sarcastic. Anyway, so obviously, though, regardless of what you think about two audiences, here we know he's directly addressing the majority Gentile audience, saying this is for you specifically. And I think what we see here, if anything, I personally, my take is this signals less for the audience's sake as far as trying to understand who Paul has been speaking to, and more for the audience's sake to understand who the interlocutor is about to become. Because what we see later on in this chapter, you have the branches were broken off thing, right? And that's not Paul's voice. He's speaking for the interlocutor. And I think verse 13 here sets up the change, because I think we've all agreed as we've gone through the first 10 chapters that the interlocutor has been Jewish.
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, and that's also because of that, like Romans 11. If Romans 9 is where the Calvinists like to go, Romans 11 is like the dispensational proof text. So that's kind of what they would say is like, oh, the interlocutor has been Jewish, and here you see the distinction between Israel and the church, and blah 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 blah.
Well, I do actually think it will. I'm not a dispensationalist, but if they agree with me that the interlocutor since chapter 2 and 6 and 7 and on through is Jewish, that's correct. And I think what Paul's signaling to emphasize, I am speaking to you now, Gentiles, shifts who the diatribe voice is from a Jewish interlocutor to a Gentile interlocutor.
Yeah, but you wouldn't say that they are completely distinct. Like Israel and the church are completely distinct in an eschatological sense. Like you would say, the true Israel would be the believers, right?
I lean that way, but that's I've been leaning that way in the past few episodes just because of the way we've been putting this together in Paul's language. But I'm not married to it.
Be based. True Israel's the believers.
How base can you get when you're like, I don't know, I lean that way. I don't have to. I'm not going to plant a flag on every theological issue I don't have.
It's more fun.
Pritchett's been run away from conditional immortality for like 10 years now. He ain't planting his flag.
Dude, it's a nice hill to die on, and at least you'll be dead. Okay, like this.
Yeah, you get to go out like Braveheart screaming Christian freedom, dispensationalism.
I'm not a dispensationalist.
No dispensationalism.
But I'm a fence sitting Amil. I don't care that much. But
she actually is.
I lean that way, and I lean Israel, true Israel, spiritual, whatever is the church. But I'm not married to that, and I can be convinced. I can also be convinced by historic premill people if I ever want to, I'm open. But my point here is rhetoric. And rhetoric, this is a signal that, hey, pay attention, Gentiles. And he's also signaling that there's a change in who the interlocutor is, because in Romans 9 and all the way back to 2 and 3, he's been arguing with a Jewish interlocutor, I think, all the way through. And now this is a signal that he's going to be changing that up, because it's not a Jewish interlocutor that's going to say, well, branches were broken off so we could be grafted in, because that's obviously Gentile. But what's not obvious to a lot of interpreters is that the interlocutor was Jewish up until this point. And you know me, I think that understanding the rhetorical context is as important as anything else, because I like socio-rhetorical criticism and all that, whatever. So I just want to highlight that so that everyone knows what's going on in the text, that Paul is setting up not just a shift in who he's speaking to as a matter of emphasis, but who will be speaking as the interlocutor. And this is the only time I think that he has. And what's interesting about this is Paul has never accepted the premise, including Romans 9, verse 20. He's never accepted the premise of his interlocutor at all. And here he kind of does. He says, fair enough. He says, quite right, in verse 20 here. So that's important to highlight, in my opinion. No one else cares, but I think it's important.
I love how it's the rhetoric that you care about, not the things that actually other people really care about.
Well, like I said, you can argue next week that this is all Israel will be saved is the Jew plus Gentile church, and that the church is. You can make that argument next week, and I'm open to it. I lean that way, but I'm not like gonna die on that hill, and I probably won't after next week or next episode anyway. So,
yeah.
I don't think that if you hold that view that you're a Jew-hating, anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist who thinks, all the crazy stuff that it's all over Twitter right now.
I'm just asking questions.
Yeah. We're going to get into that on the church split, aren't we, Will?
Oh, yes, we are. It is going to be awesome.
Far be it. I have been spending the last, week and a half on X, formerly known as Twitter, defending Dr. James White, because I'm Team James White right now.
Which is 100%. Crazy. Now
and all these people who are being all rude to Dr. White, I'm like, you sit down. Sit down. You don't know what you're doing.
It's the apocalypse.
Sometimes your own medicine tastes good.
Well, I'm Team Dr. White. He's awesome on this.
All right, so we've looked at verses 11 through 13 in about 45 minutes. At this rate, shoot, Junior is going to be here next year.
Okay. But whatever. Paul's saying his ministry is to the Gentiles, and whatever the Jews have done is the trespass, which I take to be rejecting their Messiah. God is going to use that for his people, his flesh, literally in the Greek, the Jewish people, to bring them in as well later on. So God's up to something in spite of Jewish rejection. God's in control. God is sovereign. We use that language around here. And he has a plan and a purpose in all of this. So verse 15, for if their rejection proves to be reconciliation, here is back to the lesser to greater thing. What will their acceptance be but resurrection, life from the dead, right? He's saying that's got to be the question here. Do you think that resurrection, he's pointing towards the final end time thing? This is eschatological. That whenever the Jews come back into the fold, when their time of rejection is over, it's not just the remnant, that's when life from the dead happens. That's when the final parousia, Jesus returns, resurrection, all that stuff he was talking about in Romans chapter 8. Or does that mean something less than that?
I mean, there's only one resurrection, and Paul tells us literally every spot is when Christ returns.
Yeah, so that's literally, he's saying their rejection means the whole world, all the Gentile people get to come in. What will their acceptance be when they start to come back in? That's when the Jews all convert to... See, and this is, Will, is why, this statement right here is why I'm not entirely sold that he's talking about Jew plus Gentile equals Israel, and that he just means Israel all the way through here, because he's talking about when the Jews come back, when Israel comes back, when Israel is saved, the resurrection.
I mean, that's how I think of it too. Like as I read that, it seems because then you ask yourself, what is this great blessing that he's referring to? Of if they were to be grafted back in, they reject, and what if they come back? And it the only thing I can think about is eschatological, looking on him whom they have pierced kind of theology.
Yeah, so the people of God, the children of Abraham.
Yeah, I'm not saying this is irrefutable into the non replacement or draft, whatever you want to call that. I'm not saying you can't work around it, Will. I'm just saying that this is one of those things where he's clearly talking about you have Gentiles and you have Jews, and the Gentiles are coming in, and then when the Jews come in, then there's the end of the world, everyone's resurrected, and that's what we want is Israel to be saved so that we have the final.
Well, this is why I think
everything he promised and God promised and Paul explained in Romans chapter 8, where creation is set free from bondage and the resurrection and the redemption of our bodies and all of that good stuff when Jews get saved.
This is why I think dispensational and replacement theology both have it wrong. When I read Romans 11, I don't see the church being the replacing Israel, and I don't see a distinction. I don't see God separating Israel and the church and be like, well, I have my chosen people, Israel, and then I have like my church, but I set aside my chosen people. Then I'm going to bring them in at the end, like dispensationalism teaches. What I see is like what I don't know any other word to call it besides like expansion theology, where it's like he has the covenant and now it's been expanded to the Gentiles, and some people have chosen to like reject, and I don't know if that's even a good word for it. I am trying to figure out a good word for it. Amber, you made a face again. I'd love to hear
call it grafting
in. I mean, yeah, but if you're grafting it in, it's like an expansion, right?
Israel has always been Jew and Gentile from the beginning.
That is true because they always had proselytes.
No, because when Israel left Egypt,
it was a mixed multitude. Yeah, I understand. I understand,
yes.
But Israel was defined not by ethnicity, but by covenant. We know all that. Well, maybe our viewers,
too, but there's that.
Maybe not everyone watching knows all that.
Amber keeps shaking her head, and I'd like to hear from the person who says everyone's wrong all the time. I want to hear what's right.
Right. Why is Will? I want to hear why Will is wrong. Please explain why Will.
I want to know why Pritchett's wrong.
Okay,
I can't be wrong. I haven't said anything. I haven't planted a flag yet. I'm indifferent on this.
That's why nobody's called me wrong yet, because I haven't planted my flag anywhere.
Okay, so this question is a question that is wrestled with by the prophets from Joshua to Malachi. Who are the people of God? And they are wrestling with this question and wrestling with this question and wrestling with this question, and it's left unanswered at the end of the Old Testament, whichever order you read it in.
So now Amber's not planting a flag.
Hang on. Now, hang on. Let me get to the point, Wes. Be quiet. Okay. And Christ comes on the scene. We've got that whole thing. The Gospels happen. Acts happens. And now we've got this new thing. What in the heck is it? And what are we supposed to do with it? And the rest of the New Testament, we're reading everybody else's mail, trying to figure out who are the people of God. Because of Christ, how does that change? It's the same question in the same group of people that you're dealing with. Who are the followers of Yahweh? Who are the followers of God? Christ is the answer to that question. It's everyone who is a follower of Yahweh through Christ. That is the overall, like, big picture narrative view of this, I think, of this argument, at least starting in the Old Testament and going forward.
Well,
I absolutely agree with that. And that absolutely does not settle the question.
I was speaking first, Pritchett. I got in there first. You'll notice in verse 15, this actually corroborates Amber's point, at least at a minor way. You'll notice it's not reconciliation of Jew and pagan, but reconciliation of the cosmos. And the NIV says brought reconciliation to the world. It's reconciliation of.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And then you have this horribly theologically deterministic clause that follows. What will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? So the acceptance of what? The acceptance of each other, or the acceptance of what God is doing?
No.
I mean, if we're talking socio-rhetorical and socio-cultural, that's certainly a piece of. I'm not saying it's the whole batch, Pritchett. I'm saying it's a piece of the dough, of the interpretive dough.
No.
But point being,
11 is clear. This is talking about salvation. 14
I didn't say
it
wasn't about salvation. I affirmed with you about resurrection.
Yeah, 15. This is talking about final resurrection at the end. So their acceptance would be their acceptance back into the covenant, salvation. Their acceptance is what will their acceptance by God be? Is what I think he's saying here.
I mean, I'm not denying that.
I know, but you don't have to.
Then don't argue with me.
But you don't have, but you're not explicitly affirming it either. Now, back to what Amber said. Amber, I agreed with everything that you said, but that doesn't address the question that's on the table that we're going to get to next
It
week.
just means you asked a bad question, Pritchett.
No, I'm just saying that
I'm being a
doesn't
smart aleck.
that
I love you,
doesn't
Pritchett.
prove one way or the other whether or not Israel is the Jew plus Gentile church, or in this context, is that what Paul means by Israel will be all Israel will be saved? Or that doesn't I'm saying, and maybe we need to get Dr. Allen here because he'll poo-poo all of us either firmly agreeing with that or even me who leans that way, but not firmly. We need somebody to push back on us, I guess. But because that doesn't, what you said doesn't really answer that question, that they were wrestling with that question. Well, we're still wrestling with that question tonight, you know?
Well, that's because I mean, I would say the same thing where it's like, yeah, it's obviously like the true people of Yahweh are those who follow Yahweh through Jesus Christ. I think that's true. But when he's talking about the Jew-Gentile relationship and the grafting into the branches, which is clearly the Gentiles are being grafted into this covenant more broadly, I think unless I'm completely incorrect there, that's why I'm like, I don't know if I would call it expansion because I've never liked any words I could come up with how I view that because I'm like expansion
theology.
It's Paul's language. Just use the Bible language. Grafting.
What? Grafting.
Grafting in theology. A grafting theology.
Well, I find it,
and it turns out. Well, we'll get there. We'll get there because we got to talk about whether or not Paul was a city boy who completely miffed this metaphor, if it was a metaphor instead of an allegory or a analogy or whatever it was. Was he a city boy or was he actually right about it? It seems like people have come since Ramsey to the defense of Paul that he actually got this correct. But he was actually spot on with his homesteading metaphor here about grafting olive trees. But we're not there yet because Paul, we have to deal with where are we at? Verse 16. First piece of dough. Here we're back to lumps. It was a lump of clay in chapter 9. Now he's talking about a lump of dough. Root, who's the root? The branches. Of course, the first piece of dough echoes Numbers. Here you go, Amber. Numbers 15, 20, 21. Of the first of your dough, you shall lift up as a cake, as an offering, and the offering of the threshing floor. So you shall lift it up. From the first of your dough, you shall give to the Lord an offering throughout your generations. Anyway, that's consecrated and holy, which is what Paul's point is, echoing this language. That if this first lump of dough, this is the sanctified, holy, set apart, all of that, then the rest will be setting up his root and branches thing here. And the question is, what was that first piece of dough? What is the lump? I say the lump has, just like in Romans 9, from the same lump of clay, the lump of dough here is always same here. I think this is talking about Israel, but some would say the lump and root would be Jesus or the patriarchs or the first converts.
I was thinking patriarchs with the root.
Well, see, that's what, because he's going to get into the patriarchs in a little bit. So, and plus he already introduced that back in chapter 9. And remember, chapters 9, 10, 11 is one solid section of his disposition here in Romans. It's the refutatio part. So it's all, he introduces the patriarchs there. So it seems like that's how a lot of commentators want to go, but early church fathers from Origen forward at least seem to think that the root was Jesus. So Nick,
I don't know what I think.
Well, I mean, wouldn't that just be the full revelation? Like what, if you go back to the patriarchs, what they were representing was the coming about of the Messiah through them, the sacred promise.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like the fulfillment of that.
I mean, root is central to John the Seer's Christology, the root of David, which Paul kind of echoes a little bit of seed of David in Romans 1.
That's what I was thinking
that
too.
might be a corroborative piece of data. I'm not sure that doesn't answer the whole thing, but at least that provides a little bit. I mean, first fruits, if you look at first fruits throughout the New Testament, that's almost exclusively a Pauline idiom. In Romans 8:23, the first fruits of the spirits, and, the first convert, but first fruits of those who have fallen asleep in 1 Corinthians 15. Then the one that's interesting is 1 Corinthians 15:23, and I've been having to do dissertation work on this passage, so it's top of mind. But each in order, their own order. Christ the first fruits, that is Christ being the first fruits. Then when he comes, those who belong to him. And so aparche seems to be used often of initial or first convert of creation. James uses it first fruits of all that he has created. So it's there's that agrarian model. And holiness too is an interesting. I need to look. Yeah, that's just an interesting kind of blending of agrarian and cultic imagery. Cultic in the sense of religious, connotations, holiness, those sorts of words.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and and first fruits, what's interesting, so the first fruits, other people have, and some people, like you said, the early church fathers believed this was Jesus, the patriarchs, others even that it could be the first converts. But really, it's really interesting too, because first fruits is always about taking the excess of your harvest and offering it up to the Father in thanks, right? It's the first fruit offering for the great harvest to follow. And so it's really kind of acknowledging the Lord's blessings, being thankful for that. So I know Amber, this is Old Testament Levitical stuff, which makes her happy, but it's funny because the idea of like an excess to overflow could be first converts, because there's going to be more to come, right? The great harvest. Or it could be the patriarchs, because of the great blessings that overflow. So it's acknowledging that. And it could also be Jesus, because of all the things that stem from him that overflow as the first fruit of he also calls it the first fruits of the resurrection. So I don't know. It's like, I can see it being,
sorry, go
I
ahead.
could see it going different ways on that. And,
yeah, I mean, the typical choices are it's Abraham or all the patriarchs or the prophets, even the Jewish converts, even the earliest Gentile converts, or Christ himself.
You do have
there's a summary of the commentaries. It could be any of that.
There is this interesting. I mean, Paul uses this. It's not a parallel, so it wouldn't be the right word for it, the text. But 1 Corinthians 7 uses the language of if the making each other holy, if you have an unbelieving spouse, the other is made holy, and that sort of stuff. But it's interesting that 1 Corinthians 7 does use the language of if there is a believing spouse in an unbelieving marriage, the children are holy. And so that kind of idea of holiness being part of the equation may suggest, and I'm again very tentatively just I'm going from memory. 1 Corinthians 7:14, something like for the unbelieving or the faithless husband or the non-believing husband has been made holy through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been made holy through her husband. So basically, the Christian in the relationship sanctifies the other, and then the final clause: otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. And so you've got kind of that parallel's not the right term, but kind of the imagery there of this sense of holiness being a good contagion for the relationship and for reconciliation. And if that's the case, then you've got the issue. The question maybe isn't the who, it is, well, the calling, ethics, mindset, faithfulness, and all those sorts of things. So it may not be even about a person. It may be, well, faith, if I use a gigantic umbrella term that exemplifies ethics and history and all of that. It's not about a person at this point. He's talking about what we might call synecdoche, meaning a piece representing another, but the relationship is integral to that. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I'm thinking off the top of my head. I don't know if this is about a person. It certainly is not, what's the phrase? It's certainly not excluding that, but there is that element of holiness being central to it that I think complicates making it a person.
Well, sure. Okay.
I think actually I'm going to tend to sort of lean more Nick's direction. I think Will actually changed my mind because I was leaning towards the direction of the patriarchs, but Will's argument unconvinced me that that was what was going on here. But not because of what you would think. Like, and going back and referencing Leviticus, and my brain was stuck in Leviticus because I'm looking at this and the offerings, and you get stuck there. But then you got to go, hang on a second. If you're going to the root, if you're going to the lump where it all started, you have to go back even further to Exodus. And you're back in Exodus 22, 23, and the giving of Torah, that is the formal stamp, the birth of Israel. And the first thing God does in that is not give them Torah, is it declares them holy. You are my people, you are holy. And then here is how not only do you live out that holiness, but you also continue to increase in holiness as you live out the praxis of Torah. So you start holy, and then you have to do these things that I give you as your praxis is really the only word for it, as this praxis, this liturgy of living out, continuing to maintain your holiness, not in a meritorious way, but in this liturgical way, and that also increases your holiness. And so if the root of what was given, that was the birth of Israel, is holy, everything that's going to come and follow after that is in line with
Yep.
Yeah. So I think that it's more this idea that this was born from this holiness idea that is lived out, and then that is fulfilled in Christ, and that is therefore it's almost it's about halfway there. I'm still in process, but I think we got to go back to Exodus, and I think this has more to do with the stamp of holiness.
Well, verse 28 seems to be where most people go to argue that he has the patriarchs in mind here, because they were loved on account of their fathers, and so that's kind of where they think why he has that in mind. And chapter 4 and early in chapter 9 still being, because remember, they wouldn't take weeks off like we did. They would be reading this straight. So that's why they think that would be but early church fathers still say Jesus. The Sunday school answer, if you ever teach kids church, it's like Jesus, it's the answer to everything. And that, something to that. But anyway, like I said, there's plenty of options there, and the commentaries are all over the place taking any one of those options. So don't ever let anyone tell you that they've got this figured out, because it's whatever commentary you believe. But if you read more than one, you're going to get a bunch of different answers. So
that's why you should read more than one, right?
Right. So you can end up with, well, it could be Abraham, it could be Jesus, it could be all the patriarchs, it could be the earliest Jewish converts, could be okay. So you got a lot of choices here.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is that there is no truth, and that it can mean whatever you want it to mean.
I'm not saying that. It definitely means one of those. Which one? I don't know. I think
I mean, I guess maybe if we're all wrong. It's not ethics or Abraham or Christ. It is, according to verse 18, Jews.
Well, some would say like the earliest Jewish converts, but no,
it supports you.
Yeah, right. But that's the question. What is the root?
Do not consider yourself superior to those other branches. If you do, consider this: you do not support the root, but the root supports you.
Right, and that's where they get the Jewish converts, the first converts, and that's why that's one of the options, right?
I mean, I do see how that could work.
Right. Well, I mean, they all make their case,
Mm-hmm.
All the commentaries make their. I'm just giving you the spread. I agree with Peter. Paul's, who knows what he means, right? I mean, some of it's hard to understand, but it's not impossible. It's just you got to do work. But
well, Richard Hayes had this great metaphor a while back, and I'm going to butcher it, but he basically said holiness is like a virus, if we think of it positively. That when you have someone involved in a relationship or in a community that's holy, that's doing all that God would have them do that has a positive impact on stuff. And in that sense, you could say the first fruits or the first batch that goes into a community is holy, and thus people are impacted by holiness and righteousness. And we're seeing that when Christians go into the public sphere and engage in justice and righteousness, and communities and young people are looking at the church now with new eyes and fresh eyes. So maybe we're seeing that in real time.
Prudence McFrugal says he is the first risen from the dead, which if we go back to the first fruits conversation, and the fact that in verse 15 is talking about life from the dead and Jesus being the first, that's another argument for the root being Jesus. That's where that's the same kind of argumentation that those who say Jesus is the root. And of course, that has a lot of support in the early church fathers, at least from Origen forward. So,
Actually, no, Pritchett, I've solved it. If you take it as the faith of Jesus Christ, then it's Jesus plus ethics plus Jewish history plus Jewish converts.
plus
Done.
Patriarchs, plus it's everything, all of the above.
So the subjective genitive of Romans 3:22 solves the debate yet again. We've unlocked Romans, everyone. We can go home now.
Well, what I would be more inclined to believe, rather than he meant all of these things, is more like he meant one of these things, but if you squint your eyes, you can make all the other things work as well.
Well, he's doing biblical theology, which means there's lots of echoes, allusions, and ideas bouncing.
But which one did he mean, Derek?
Well, clearly, whichever one I decide at the end of the day.
Exactly.
Protestant.
All right, let us know what you think. Who is the root? Comment section. We want to hear from you. Who is the root? Because
for the Dodge.
Who or what?
We're just going to put a pin in that. We're just telling you what it could be. We're not telling you what it is. And we're going to move to verse 17. But if some of those branches were broken off, and you, meaning Gentiles, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them and became partaker with them of the rich root, which throws another wrinkle into it. You grafted in and become a partaker. You're grafted in among them and you become a partaker with them, people like Paul, the Jews, of the rich root. So maybe that's not the Jews. Of the olive tree. Of course, the olive tree is a easily accessible symbol. It's a symbol of Israel. It's all over the Old Testament.
It's a symbol of good Italian food.
Yeah, it's all over the Mediterranean world. Well, Job 18:16, Jeremiah 17:8, Ezekiel 31:8, Hosea 9:16, Sirach 1:20, and Sirach 40:15.
What do you call Sirach when it gets spicy? Sriracha.
Yeah. Planted by God himself, Psalm 92:13, Jeremiah 11:17, the Psalms of Solomon 14:3-1. First Enoch, for all you Enoch fans, the olive tree makes God planted that there in 86 verse 6. So
he's cleaning out his belly button, y'all. That's why he's looking down, just so you know.
So no mystery why he picks the olive thing. And then, of course, people want to say, what is he doing with this metaphor? Does he know what he's even talking about with this stuff? Hey, you turned your camera on. Theophrastus talks about grafting domesticated olive trees into wild olive trees in his ancient writings. And then Columella, who is a contemporary of Paul, talks about grafting wild branches into domesticated ones. So it turns out Paul knew what he was talking about all the time, and he didn't just pull this out of a hat of this grafting in stuff.
Suck it, Peter.
Wow. Okay, so Paul's onto something with this. Branches were broken off. Those are obviously Jewish branches. You, being the wild olive, were grafted in among those branches and became a partaker with them of the rich fruit of the olive tree. Do not be arrogant towards the branches. And the branches here, I think, would mean the branches still attached to the root, not the branches that were broken off. But because this is setting up the weak and the strong stuff in 14 and 15. Nick, is that what you think too?
I mean, I think Paul's whole point is really to get to verses or chapters 14 and 15.
Yeah, no, but I mean, he's saying don't be arrogant towards the branches. Is he talking about the branches that were broken off or the branches that are still part of the root or both? I think
Derek's right. The answer is yes.
Yeah, that's weak. See, this is where I'll actually plant a flag, and I think he's talking about, because he's getting into this stuff later in the book, I think he is talking about, don't be arrogant towards the branches. Don't be arrogant towards the Jew converts that are in the churches at Rome that are having these issues with the Gentile churches. That's what I think. But I mean, I guess you could expand that if you want to be
I agree
yes
with you, Pritchard. I think he's got 14 and 15 and it's strong and the weak in mind. And I think that's one of Paul's major ethical issues, is dealing with supremacist ideologies in his churches.
Yeah. Don't be arrogant towards the branches, but if you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. Verse 18. So he's saying that you have this goes back to arrogant, goes back to boasting. You are not there because of you. You were there because of others. Or
by the way, I love that an alternate rendering of the verb for support can be tolerate.
Yeah.
I'm like, that sounds pretty good.
Yeah. So Paul's point is, you have no reason for arrogance at all because you're supported by the root. You don't support the root. You're supported by it.
You weren't part of the tree till God yanked it up and stuck you on and said, all right, now you figure out how to live together, literally.
Right. Exactly. And now we come to the interlocutor again, where Paul is going to do, for the first time, in my opinion, a non-Jewish interlocutor, the Gentile, because that's who he's talking to. You will say, you Gentile, I think is what he means here, because he's talking to you Gentiles. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. Verse 20 says, quite right. This is the first time he does not just emphatically rejected the premise of either a rhetorical question or from the interlocutor, because the interlocutor was Jewish. He never said quite right anytime an interlocutor has ever said anything until right here, which is why I don't think you can ever say he accepted the premise, even the premise of how can he still find fault? Who can resist his will? Paul doesn't accept that entire claim. That's why he refutes it in verse 20 when you understand it properly in chapter 9. Here's the first time in the entire book that he actually accepts, kind of, because he qualifies it here, but he says, quite right. You're right when you say that branches were broken off. They were passively, means God broke them off. They were broken off for their what? Unbelief. And this is where we get into this weird thing about, is this not a text for conditional security versus eternal security? Quite right. They were broken off for their unbelief, but you stand by your faith. And then he says, okay, so you're right, but do not be conceited, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. Now, as I said at the beginning of the program, here's why I don't think this is a great proof text for the view that I hold, which is conditional. I'm not a once saved, always saved, not a perseverance of the saints. I believe in conditional security, but here's why I don't think this is a good text. He's talking to Gentiles as a corporate group, and he's talking about Jews as a corporate group. And so he's saying God has broken off and sent his, not exclusively, but his primary mission focus now is sending people like Paul to Gentiles. But that can change. If the Gentile nations become arrogant, God can just as well cut them. If he's going to cut off the chosen Old Testament, Old Covenant people for their unbelief, and you get arrogant, you need to be afraid, because God can just cut that spigot off too. The grace that's going out to the world, that can be cut off as well. So now, if you're a Calvinist, you love to point out when you're arguing against, corporate language, you're like, yeah, corporate's made up of individuals. Great. Then it is a proof text for me. If you want to make that argument that, well, remember, it's all individuals. Corporate bodies are made up of individuals. Okay, well, you want to argue that? Fine. I love how our Calvinists and our Southern Baptist friends who are eternal security people, they understand corporate language when it suits their purposes, and then they jettison it when it doesn't, especially our Calvinist friends in Romans 9, even though Paul's still talking about nations and people groups and Jews and Gentiles, not individuals ever. But here, if you use that and then you use the Thomas Schreiner thing, yeah, Brian Bassiano, but corporate people, individuals are what makes up corporate bodies. So this applies to individual. Okay, so if an individual stops believing, God chops them off. But still, because I like to try to be as consistent as possible, I think he's talking about what God's dealing with reconciliation of the world. He's not exclusively focusing on Gentiles. He's still, Jews are still being saved too, but not many. But it's gone out to the Gentiles. But if the Gentiles ever get arrogant or whatever, they need to fear, because God can cut that off and redirect his attention elsewhere. And so I think he's talking about the primary emphasis of God's current stage of where the mission is of redemption, the program of redemption. And I don't think that this is really much to say about can an individual lose his salvation. Now, y'all tell me why I'm wrong.
No,
well,
actually,
before you get into that argument, can we just stop for a second and back up and look at what the olive tree means before we argue about the rest of what all that does for just a second? Because I think it's going to help a little bit.
But right? I grabbed all my weapons and was ready to go to war.
Then you could go to war after that, Will. You can do whatever you want. I don't care.
No.
I'm just saying we got to understand the symbol before we fight about what it means, right?
Preach. Okay. Okay.
So the olive tree in the Old Testament usually when you see the word like olive or a reference to olive tree, it usually means the tree and not necessarily the fruit. There's a specific word that denotes the fruit itself. So, but the tree itself takes a long time. Olive trees take a long time to mature. And when Israel entered the promised land, part of the promise that they were given and walked into was an already prepared land full of olive trees ready to harvest from. There wasn't any preparation was already done for them. So they inherited a fully fleshed out, fully grown, fully mature olive trees. So there was a lot of preparation in that point. But even though that was the case and they got to enjoy the blessings that they did not plant, which comes out of Joshua 24, God's judgment could result in the loss of the olive crop, which is Deuteronomy 28, Amos 4. And God gives them instructions for the olive trees only to beat them, to harvest the olive fruits out of them once and to leave the rest for the disadvantaged. So he's caring for the poor. So there's an element of caring for the poor involved in an olive tree. But Isaiah, that's from Deuteronomy 24. Isaiah has the imagery that becomes a metaphor for the remnant left after God's judgment, Isaiah 17, and Jeremiah uses the burning of the olive tree to depict Judah's demise, Jeremiah 11. The olive tree is also featured in portraits of personal flourishing, like in Psalm 52, and Israel's restoration in Isaiah 14:6. So that's kind of the picture that's being painted in the Old Testament of an olive tree.
And I think that helps me. I think that helps me. And I think
this is why Amber says that everything that New Testament scholars gets wrong is because they're not Old Testament scholars.
Okay.
It's because they don't know their Old Testament. That's right.
I got you, Amber. I got you. I'm used to being rebuked by you at this point. It's fine.
Yeah. Every day on Twitter, I see more and more. Well, maybe Pritchett is right about some things as long as it's not the Bible. And Wes is wrong about everything, whether it's the Bible or not. So I'm still winning. So
it's true.
Anyway,
I'm used to it.
Fire your weapons, Will.
I actually don't have many weapons. I honestly mostly agree with you. It's just I don't think, and this is why I said at the top of the show that I don't think this is a passage I would necessarily go to if I was like in a debate and I'm going to be like, Romans 11 teaches conditional security, because it is speaking like Romans throughout. One of the biggest problems with Romans is that people look at Romans as a book that's dealing with individual salvation and not corporate relationships. And so I agree with that. But I do think it does show something, because I don't think Paul uses words accidentally, especially as a Pharisee, and as a former Pharisee, I should say, and as a scholar, who he was. He even uses the word stumbled, and in ancient Jewish sources, that word stumbled is idiomatic for become apostatized. So that same exact word is kind of indicating like if your corporate group is rejecting the God they said that they follow, like, oh, we follow Yahweh, but there's this giant group that's rejecting them, that does the end result is still apostasy in one way or another. So I wouldn't say it's like a go-to text for conditional security. I would just say it's a reinforcement text once you've already built the groundwork that security is conditional, and then you can point to this and be like, even over here we can kind of see how that works in practice, if that makes sense.
Nick.
Okay, that was okay.
Yeah, nobody was
He's
impressed.
speechless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to hear Nick. Because you and I have been issuing challenges to any pair that would take us on from the once saved, always saved camp. So if you're doing debate prep for a debate that we can't ever get to happen, would this be a text for you?
Well, Pritchett, if we could get a date down, we couldn't change it. So they'd be forced to debate us, because once debate, always debate.
There you go.
But that's why they won't commit to a debate out of their free will.
What pair?
Pritchett, you want a name drop?
Huh?
The debate opponents. Do you want to?
Well, we've challenged just about everybody from Malcolm Yarnell and Braxton and Leighton and all kinds of people. Nobody wants a piece of that. So,
They know they lose.
One of the things we wanted was
Pritchett and I would say salty, mean, sassy things.
Well, we wanted to debate non-Calvinists, because if you debate Calvinists, then it's another Calvinism debate, and that's
boring.
I'm tired of Calvinism debates. Those are old news. It would be great to have non-Calvinists debate this issue instead of so you don't have to debate Calvinism along with everything else. We're just it stays
Pritchett,
focused on
that's where I disagree, because it'd be you and me basically debating Calvinists, just inconsistent ones.
Right. Well, I think Leighton Flowers and all Southern Baptists are Calvinists, because the only thing that Calvin ever came up with on his own was the eternal security, perseverance of the saints thing. Everything else was he just connected what Lutherans all the way back to Augustine didn't ever connect, and he just made saved in eternity past as saved in eternity future once saved. That's Calvin's only original idea. And so I agree with Al Mohler when he said, to some extent, all Southern Baptists, wherever you are on the 5 points, you affirm one of them, and that's the one thing Calvin came up with on his own. So you're a Calvinist, and I'm like, Al Mohler is correct. All Southern Baptists are Calvinists. So
for me, this wouldn't be the text I would go to. My view is the 1 Timothy 2 text for the once saved, always saved folks is basically the entire book of Hebrews, to be obviously facetious about it. I think that's the text that's like, I got to do it.
Well, David, Dr. Allen would beg to differ, because I know
he would, and I've read his stuff, and I would beg to differ with his beg to differ.
Well, yeah, his commentary is outstanding. I can't wait for the revision, even though I disagree with him on that aspect. His commentary is great.
So outstanding, it needed to be revised.
Come on, all commentaries get revised. Yeah, dude, that's
I'm teasing.
Yeah.
Derek is just choosing random violence for no reason.
Now,
like throwing a hand grenade.
I gotta add
expanded. That's normal. That's what scholars do. Blah blah. Derek.
I mean, I don't know. James White's never released a revised edition of any of his books.
He would tell you they were perfect the first time.
Well, yeah, from the pen. Anyway, this text I wouldn't consider to be the go-to text. But having read, excuse me, a few different takes on it from a non, I use the phrase soteriological contingency. That's kind of my understanding of it. I think this is one of those texts where they can make their view consistent with it, but I don't think the text naturally arrives at their conclusion, if that makes sense. Because there's certain texts you can read and you can go, okay, I can see how, given your hermeneutical pre-commitments, your paycheck, your background, your history, all those things, because all those things have an impact on where we go, at least in some sense. I can see how you can interpret it consistently within your own perspective. I just don't think the text fits with your perspective. And so I think your perspective needs to change.
Yeah, I mean...
But I also wouldn't use this text as, okay, I'm going to hit you with a hard text. All right, let's go with this one, because this one takes a long time to unpack. I actually would preferably go to Romans. I would actually use Romans 8 through 11 as kind of my whole text. specifically starting in Romans 8. But I think the imagery that's placed, sparing unbelief or faithlessness, those sorts of images do not immediately make me think, yes, once saved, always saved.
Yeah, well, my thing is,
I don't think Paul is addressing Calvin's concern.
Right. I think this would be fair to say that this is consistent with what we think about at the individual level everywhere else in Scripture. So, I mean, in that sense, this is consistent with that. So it fits better with that. But like you, I wouldn't go here. I would just point out that this is consistent with that. But I mean, when it's plural, if he's talking about God not spare the natural branches,
is the contingency language.
Yeah.
And the problem in verse 23 specific, even if they do not continue or persist in unbelief, will be grafted in.
Right,
And
but he's talking about, but like I said, though, he's talking about Israel or unbelieving Jews as a whole. He's not talking about specific individuals who convert to Christianity, like himself and the other Jews in and around Jerusalem. So he's just talking about in broad strokes unbelieving Israel. If unbelieving Israel as a whole doesn't continue, majority rejection, and then if you continue in belief, talking about the Gentile converts in general, the mission going on, because he's talking about God's strategy here, right? God has had to deal with the fact that, well, Israel's rejecting their Messiah, not entirely. There's a remnant, and there's a remnant of Gentiles as well that's coming in. And so he's dealing with God's strategy. He's going to use their jealousy, indignation, whatever we translate that as. He's using that as part of his plan. And Paul sees his mission to Spain as part of that plan. And that's why he's trying to get money. He's trying to say, don't be arrogant. You are grafted into this root, whatever you decide the root is. You're part of this olive tree, and we need to go make Spain part of the olive tree. So send me money. But we don't need to be arrogant or boastful. We need to, because the kindness and severity, kindness echoes Romans 2:4, the kindness of God to lead you to repentance. There's still time here. But the severity of God to those who fell, severity, but to you, God's kindness, if you continue in his kindness, like you said, it's contingency. For otherwise, you too will be cut off. And they also, if they don't continue in their unbelief, will be grafted back in. So this is also reminiscent of what he was saying in Romans chapter 9, by the way, which is why you can't have the pots, the vessels be static categories, because you have both God's kindness and severity at play with everyone.
Pritchett, I think you're overcomplicating it. The people in the corporate group go over to the other corporate group. It's not about individualized this and this, because they still go from the one corporate group to that corporate group.
Right.
So it's not about the individuals. It's about diffusion of what you might want, whatever you want to call it. So
I didn't complicate that at all. That's what I was saying.
No,
it's not about individuals. That was my argument.
Well, here's how I could conceive of a once saved, always saved advocate assimilating this passage to be like not contradictory to their view. And I mean, I might be opening a whole other can of worms because I'm making reference to the book of Revelation, but my mind just kind of went to Jesus telling the church of Ephesus that if they don't change this, he'll come and remove their lampstand, right? Yeah. And so I guess that if you're willing to read it as you being cut off isn't you are no longer saved, but it is this group that I am referring to right here is now being cut off from this commission, kind of like leaving them to Satan for the destruction of the body, something like that. And which, I don't know, could see a similar parallel to how the Jews are being treated at this time. I'm not saying this. I'm just saying if I were to argue that position, I could see something similar to that, kind of what Pritchett was saying about like a collective group. Maybe it's a church, maybe it's Gentiles as a whole, maybe it's, whatever, because I mean, it does say branches. So like there's, I don't know, it just seems like there's multiple branches, not one branch of Israel, one branch of Gentiles, if that makes sense. So maybe it's like individual churches, groups. Maybe he's talking to the Romans specifically. I mean, who knows?
Yeah, which is why you got to be consistent when you understand corporate language. Ephesians 1's corporate language, Romans 9's corporate language. You got to be consistent. Even if you name checks individuals, that's still typology for representation of people who identify with those individuals. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Pharaoh, all of that in Romans 9 still typology. So it's still corporate dealings, even if he mentions, individuals. And same thing with here, which is why I was saying in Romans 9, the vessels of wrath, vessels of mercy, those aren't static categories, because God's kindness and severity is always in operation depending on unbelief or belief. Now, like, if you want to say that can apply to individuals, I agree. But see, Derek, the beauty of having a conditional security position is I can still exegete this and come out in the same place if I need to with somebody who affirms eternal security or perseverance of the saints or whatever. Just like I can affirm with them that, yeah, some people were never saved to begin with. They were never of us. Yeah. Depart from me, I never knew you. Yeah, I'm with you on that. But I can also have this other thing where I don't have to reinterpret anything else to get out of the, conditional language. People can fall from a grace that they had received. They can shipwreck a faith that they actually had to make it shipwrecked in the first place. So I have a both and, whereas they have a and, but not a both. And so they have to do what I consider to be gymnastics to get around, so to speak, the passages that don't sit well with the eternal security crowd. Whereas I don't have to get around anything with this. It's like, yeah, I'm okay with that too. So I think it's a stronger position when you're not having to get around anything, if that makes sense. Like I can agree with you where we agree, but I also have this other thing where you disagree with me, but you're on less firm ground trying to say that, well, they shipwrecked the faith that it was never really theirs in the first place, or they fell from grace they never had, that kind of thing, Well,
I mean,
they were cut off even though they were never abiding in the first place. I mean, I don't have to do all that nonsense. Right. And still agree with them where I can, whereas they have to do all kinds of nonsense. So.
Well, it's like you and I briefly talked about this, what feels like 10 years ago, but it was like Romans 8:11 or 8:12. So then, brothers and sisters, Adelpha, we are debtors not to the flesh to live according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit or with the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. Yeah. And so I read that.
Yeah, if you, by the Spirit, meaning you have the Spirit, do this.
The Spirit.
Yeah.
But the issue is he calls them brothers. Right. And so there is that element of brothers, people of the church, people of all that. Paul's under no illusion that, again, I think the Paul who wrote 8:12 and is the same Paul who wrote Romans 11. I'm being facetious for those who will clip that and have fun with it later. But I do think the continual use of what we might say contingent language or conditional language throughout all of Romans does make reinterpreting it in a theologically deterministic way one of those where it's like I want to be polite. It doesn't seem like the text itself can be bent that far before it just breaks, and we don't want a text that's like that. And so my issue is the language of contingent language throughout Romans and throughout all of Scripture makes theological determinism as it relates to the questions, that are often at the OSAS debate, just it's too big a bitter pill to swallow. I can understand some texts being interpreted that way consistently. Like I think they can't, like I said, you can read Romans 11 in a way that is internally consistent with your worldview in the same way I think a Calvinist can read Romans 11 that's internally consistent with their worldview. I just don't buy the underlying premises of theological determinism at the heart of both of them, if that makes sense. And the use of contingent or conditional language, and Pritchard, I know you're not disagreeing with this at all. I'm just for the making great hay for those to set on fire in the chat. The presence of the perpetual reality of contingent language throughout Romans and all of Paul does make those theological determinism either. Well, I'll just stop there. It makes it very difficult to accept just on the basis of the readings of Scripture.
Right. That's why I'm not a determinist.
Or I should say, we should be clarified. So we're not selectively theologically deterministic.
Yeah, because it just doesn't. It doesn't work. That's yeah. And for those who are just tuning in, if you want to go watch our 3 or 4 episodes, we trotted through Romans 9. That was a lot of fun. That's when we had the most viewers, I think. It's because everyone, what are they going to say?
No, it's because Leighton Flowers was on the stream.
That's probably true. Too. Yeah. Well, so branches can be chopped off, grafted back on. Wild branches can be grafted on, God can chop them off if he wants to again. And those that were broken off, they too can be grafted back in. So there's all kinds of things that God can do with this tree. He can cut them off, he can put them back. Because he says, for if you were cut off what is by nature a wild olive tree, and contrary to nature were grafted into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who are the natural branches, talking about Israel again, be grafted into their own olive tree? And that's where we're going to end. But this is back to the lesser to greater thing. I mean, it's going to be even more great. How much more great would it be if we can get the Jews back on? So once again, Paul is, you have branches were broken off, others were grafted in. The ones that were broken off can be regrafted back in. The ones that were grafted in can be broken off. All kinds of fun can be had with God. Can play with his tree however he likes. Because apparently that's what Paul says. I mean, he's like, hey, break them off, he can put them back, he can break you off, even though he grafted you in if you start acting arrogant. Yeah. And that might be where, I mean, maybe he went off the rails with this allegory or metaphor or analogy or whatever. But yeah, that's basically what's going on here. Because it's God's kindness and severity. And he tells the believers in Rome that are Gentiles, because he's speaking to you Gentiles, fear, right? Don't be conceited and fear. So work out your salvation with fear and trembling. That's Paul's whole thing. Be scared. I mean, it's good. Have a healthy respect for God because he's kind but severe. So,
well, just do not remain in your unbelief.
Yeah. Well, that could be bad, corporately or individually.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So that's this section. Let's go around the horn. What do we do with this? You're prepping a sermon. You're prepping a Sunday school class. You're studying this. What's the main takeaway? We'll start with Nick. What is your takeaway from this passage? What are the main points?
I was struck by, and we didn't talk about it much, but I was struck by the language of the kindness or the goodness of God, and just that imagery of it's almost as if it's a sense of gentleness, that God's disposition towards the world is motivated not by this antagonism, although he does get provoked, as we might say, but his response to faithlessness and sinfulness and injustice and oppression is motivated by his ultimate kindness, or his hesed, his love, his steadfast love, or his loving kindness. And that imagery of that even the cutting off is an act of love designed to, get people to return. And so I would emphasize in a sermon that, as I've preached this sort of thing before, that and it might just go back to the prodigal son, which again is not a parable of the prodigal son. It's a parable of a loving father. So it might just be better to say that God is never far from you, that God's presence is with you, even in times of fallenness, or even in times of death or smoke or fire. God is present with you. And the call for the Christian is not to have all the right answers, or even the best answers, or even the best quip. It is to remain in God's kindness, which thus means that go be kind to others. Go be gentle with others. And it's easier said than done, especially in times such as these. But we are not known as Jesus was not known. Maybe this is the point. Jesus was not known for being an antagonistic, and I can't use that word, although he was antagonistic at points. Jesus was known as the person that the sinners and the sick could come to and find relief, remedy, and reconciliation and forgiveness of sin. Kindness. And so maybe the mark of the church is to be a place of kindness and of welcome and of forgiveness of sins. in a way that the world, which always keeps a record of wrongs, cannot offer.
All right. Well, Nick has no time for the severity part.
People already live it. My goal is to get them out of it.
Will, what do you got?
So, I mean, there's a few ways you could go because you could talk about the severity. So what strikes me is not the severity, but the kindness. But one of the things that like I really kind of like where Keener brings this part where he says that talking about Gentiles, you're spiritual proselytes grafted into Israel as full members. Thus, you're spiritual children of Abraham and spiritually circumcised. I really love just that kind of view where you could actually build off, if you're preaching from this, you can build off of the powerful covenant that was made with Israel and what that looks like. I mean, you're talking about the God who split the Red Sea. You're talking about the God who delivered them from Egypt, the God who, delivered them from Babylon, on and on we could go. And that you are now grafted into. Like that is the covenant you are part of. So there's that kindness that Nick was talking about as well. That is, it's something that is life-changing and could be very eye-opening for people to start seeing their value and the power that is Jesus Christ. However, the severity part, I think, is also something that, and I'd go back and forth on how I would want to do this in a sermon, because I feel like if you're going to talk about it in a sermon, you want to start off with the severity and give the solution, or talk about how awesome it is, and then at the end bring in the severity if you didn't heed the warning. So I don't know which way I'd go with that on a sermon. I think it might depend on the whole vibe of what we're doing that day. But I that's kind of thing that sticks out to me probably the most in the text is the fact that the awesomeness of the covenant made with Israel is now grafted. We are all grafted into that. So don't think about it as an ethnic thing, but as you mentioned, a corporate group.
Yeah. Well, Pauline scholars are in the same boat as you, Will, because they don't know if they want to work solution to plight or plight to solution. So you're in good company with all these Pauline people who argue all the time. Amber has had to duck out.
Her laptop crashed.
Oh man!
But I think it was just because she was listening to Will and went.
Yeah, I felt that. I was kind of like, yeah, maybe she's onto something by blanking out.
Word limit reached.
Oh, is he still going?
Word limit reached.
Yeah, basically. Is the Baptist still talking?
Yeah. Derek, your closing thoughts.
Well, I think everything said so far is pretty good. So rather than just kind of reiterate that and say it in a different way, I'm just going to give very basic, because I have the what now pulled up. What does this passage inform us about our status in Christ? It informs us that we are grafted in to this olive tree. Oh, hi, Amber. She's back.
Now that Will's done talking, she's back.
Convenient.
But yeah, so it tells us that we are grafted into this, and this is something where we can't get a big head about. There's no boasting in this because we didn't graft ourselves in. This is, something that God did for us, right? And this is who we are. We are grafted into that. However you want to go about the root and what the tree represents, Christ is at the center of it no matter what. What does this passage say to us about our vocation in Christ? I would argue that what Paul is really driving home here is that we should pursue holiness as members of this olive tree, right? I said I'm going to be super basic with this. What this passage teaches theologically about being in Christ, I would argue that, I guess you guys can quibble with the whole, like, did he mean jealous or did he mean this? But I think there's an element either way in there that we live our lives in such a way that in our holiness, people see Christ, right? And I would tie that into apologetics. I'm not as good as Pritchett is about finding like, oh, here's an apologetic I can dig out of this verse. So I'm just going to do kind of a cheap cop out and say our apologetic should be undergirded by a life of holiness that matches what we are defending.
Interestingly enough, that's Peter's argument in the apologist's favorite verse of 1 Peter 3:15 and 16. He's like, if you read the context, it's all about your good behavior in Christ. What is it if you're, having to deal with evil for being good? It's all about being good. It's not really about cosmological arguments and all of that business anyway. So you're on good footing with Peter and the apologetics' favorite verse because they've never read the context. But,
Greek word, they know that Greek word.
Yeah.
Context, I'm pro-text.
Right. Amber, your thoughts.
You're muted, boss. How would
You're
you preach this
muted.
text?
Muted for the complementarians who don't want to learn anything. You're
Yeah, Mark Driscoll hacked the chat.
I do not permit a woman to teach.
She can't speak because I might learn something.
You're still muted there,
I
Amber.
don't think she knows how to unmute it.
Oh, she can't figure it out.
Okay, Amber, type it to me and I will read it.
No, it should be just right under on the screen. The like little.
Oh,
mic
she
button.
froze up. She froze
she'll
up.
message me this time.
Oh.
Oh,
She's got resting Willis talking face.
We'll see if she can figure
Look,
it out.
I know my voice is annoying. I'm from Yankee Land. I can't do anything about it. All right.
Annoying,
I wish I saw.
nasal.
Shut up, Mr. Arkansas. Like,
I know
okay.
it. I'm proud of it. I'm proud of my accent.
I still can't get over how much fun we had when Pritchard had his stuff with the teachers talking like this.
Oh man,
Talking like,
let me tell you.
like Sling Blazing.
my when I get dental work, it's over.
Pritchard goes from the IQ of 500 to the IQ of.
Hey, speaking of Sling, it's filmed in Arkansas.
Mm-hmm.
Billy Bob
Actually,
Thornton.
it's a shockingly Christian movie if you actually watch it. It's one of the most Christian movies you'll ever watch.
Speaking of actually random Christian movies right now, like movies like the movie Homestead that came out recently was actually good. Like a friend.
I heard that.
I saw Gladiator too. That was the last movie I saw.
It was like actually good. Like I think this is the best part. All right, this is a great way to end the show. Talk about this. Hollywood is burning to the ground, not literally, even though it is.
I'm like 30 minutes from all that, so you behave now.
No. Hold on. But then it's like I didn't mean it literally until I said it. I was like, bad analogy. But with all their woke nonsense, their quality is going down. But then like now, like Christian media started to figure out how to put out bangers, and I just can't help but feel vindicated. Like finally, Christians are like, maybe we shouldn't preach at people, but actually just tell like good stories that people would like. Because there's like one part of the movie straight up where it's like home invaders and stuff that I was like, I felt anxious, and I was like, yep, that feels real. I like this. This is good.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think what happened there is
Wes broke my computer, so that's what I.
Wes, but speaking of what you were saying, I think what happened there is the woke Hollywood trash got so blatant in their preaching that a bunch of Christian filmmakers were like, is this what we were doing? Like the Christian version of this?
Yeah, that's what made
Christian cinema.
Yeah. Hollywood decided to make everything that we hated about Christian movies
how
exactly what they're going to do. And so, and they went as preachy as Christian movies and became as bad as most Christian movies, right? That's exactly what happened.
Worse. At least Christians don't show you naked people doing stuff.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, there's still the production values are terrible. The acting's usually bad. I mean, I know people say, well,
Gladiator 2 was like the last movie I saw in theaters for a year, and that was okay. It needed to be like another hour long.
I saw Sonic 3 last.
All the Sonic movies have actually so far been good. I haven't seen the third one, but
I think it's the best of them.
I've been watching Seinfeld.
Wow.
Seinfeld's actually pretty good, and I started watching Sanford and Son. So
we're going back to Doctor Who. That's what my wife and I have been doing.
Ew.
Awful. That goes downhill. Somewhere in the middle of quality season, that goes off the rails.
No. That's the thing. So you only watch the first season with Capaldi, then you're done. The rest of it does not exist.
Okay. Well, I'm watching Moonlighting because
I'm
80s is the best.
I'm watching Star Trek, the original series.
That's been on my to-do list.
All right, Pritchett.
Wait, what? Whoa! You mean you've never seen it?
Like a long time ago, dude. Like I want to watch it as an adult now.
So anyway, this is all to keep me from giving my final thoughts on the thing.
Because nobody cares.
I
It's all
thought
been
we
your
go to-
final thoughts.
Yeah, we go to
Right,
8:30. We had to pad the time a little.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, I'm going to wrap this up because, look, when I look at this passage, I think about the sovereignty of God. Because no matter what is going on in the ground, God wants to reconcile the entire world, and he has a plan, and he can prepare for any contingency, including his own chosen nation of Israel rejecting their Messiah. And in light of that, God is still going to reconcile the whole world and still has his eye on Israel as well, is what we learn from this passage. And I like how this passage does balance the kindness, which is a theme in Romans back to chapter 2, God's kindness is to lead you to repentance, but severity as well. It is a call against arrogance. It is a reminder to have fear. Because if you think about this in terms of nations, you can say when entire populations, not all Jews, because some Jews are being saved, not all Gentiles, but if you look at the nations, for example, I mean, where you see Christianity decline in certain places in the West, you see it springing up elsewhere in the world. So God is always on the move. And so his desire is, I mean, America is pretty saturated with the gospel, right? There's no ignorance of the special revelation of God in Scripture in the United States. There's no unreached people groups, really. I mean, you could make the case that Generation Alpha, some of them may not come into contact with Christians at a very early age until they get older. So that just reminds us that we need to be more evangelistic. But still, America's got the gospel and people have rejected it, but that doesn't mean that God is not working anywhere in the world. You know, at least we become, you know, we're the only people that didn't, we're the only ones. No, God's got his people everywhere. And so that's encouraging. And that's kind of the apologetic too, that no matter how bad it looks on the ground from your particular vantage point, God and the gospel is always on the move, and he's always saving people, because that's what God wants to do, is reconcile the entire world. So it's a reminder to us that, yeah, I mean, God, if you think corporately as a nation of Gentile people, that kindness and severity, we can corporately be broken off, you know, but that doesn't mean that God's going to be done. And we can also stop continuing in unbelief as a nation, which I think, you know, that's just, again, a reminder for us to be more evangelistic. So those are the kinds of things that I think about with this passage. Now you'll talk about Dr. Who before we go.
Seinfeld or Friends, Wes?
Seinfeld or Friends?
Yeah.
Friends.
Ew. You're a Ross guy, I know that.
All right. And on that
Okay,
note,
Ross is hilarious.
No, here's the real question. Parks and Rec or The Office?
The Office. I love both, but it's The Office.
I've
The
seen
Office
neither, don't care.
Until Michael leaves, but all of Parks and Rec.
Parks and Rec all the way.
I think Parks and Rec is unwatchable from season 5 onward.
I've only
You're
seen the first 3
unwatchable
seasons.
from
Every angle.
episode 1 of During
I've
Virtue.
never seen any of this stuff y'all are talking about as far as Parks and Rec or The Office.
Really? You've never seen Seinfeld?
I mean, y'all,
that was
No,
like
I've seen
your...
Seinfeld.
He hasn't seen anything from this century because he's the kind of guy who just puts a Werther here and just goes to bed because it's past my bedtime.
Yeah, my bedtime is in 35 minutes. I go to bed at 9, get up at 5. So yeah, no shame. I never watched The Office. I never watched Parks and Rec. I have seen a lot of Seinfeld and I've seen a lot of Friends, but you know,
Just get Ron Swanson best clips on YouTube. Then you'll.
I watched that stuff when it was on television on NBC. Both of those are NBC shows, Friends and Seinfeld. I watched them a long time ago. I'm old, so I already saw that.
Give me all the bacon you got.
And with that, next week we're going to finish up chapter 11, and we're going to find out what Paul meant by all Israel being saved. I'm sure everyone's going to have a hot take about that.
And just in real fast, just so everyone's aware, depending my future in the next coming weeks, it will be possibly dicey. My wife is expecting any day. I mean, February 10th is when she's supposed to pop, but we have a history apparently of having kids early. So just so you know, I may or may not be on because we don't know what's going on.
We're in the final stretch.
We'll be we'll be praying for that. What do you got coming up on the channel?
Well, I have another Wes Huff video dropping later on this week, and I'm doing another response to Mike Winger, which people love. And by love, I mean they hate it, because apparently if you say Mike Winger is wrong, it's like you question the Pope himself, which is really funny because most of our Protestants who would reject Catholicism. But anyway, then I also have a video talking about the biggest podcast that actually beat the Joe Rogan Experience, which is a Catholic one. Fun fact. It beat them in January, which is pretty cool. So anyhow, that's pretty much what I got going on in the split. But yeah, I'm just doing responses to Mike Winger, which I still like Winger, but sometimes he's wrong, and that's okay to say. And it's okay to say that sometimes Winger makes dumb arguments, because sometimes I make dumb arguments. It's okay. Just correct it. Stop being dumb.
All right. Nick, you got anything coming up on the New Testament Theologist channel?
No, I've got a sermon / lecture I got to prepare for, and I've got preaching 2 sermons this week, one Wednesday night and one Sunday. So I'm between that dissertation, I'm tapped out.
So
lots of writing.
Do you have any plans for your channel?
I mean, some stuff here and there. I've got some stuff planned. It's just, if I ever get free time, do I want to make something for YouTube? And it's like, I'd rather just try and get some rest.
Okay, well, that's fair. I mean,
my free time is about that big.
Well, you've got some content worth watching if people haven't gone to your channel, so they can watch. Everything is new to people who have not subscribed to the New Testament Theologist. So go over to his channel and subscribe if you haven't subscribed to the Church Split. Derek, you got anything coming up?
I did just release a new video last week. It's still early in January, so if you have New Year's resolutions, you might check that out. I would actually say that you should check out Theology Geek Fitness, because Pritch is going to give much better advice. But if you want to come from an angle of how did this idiot do it, maybe he has something valuable to say, welcome to check that out. I have another video mapped out. I don't know when that'll release. I don't think you guys would be at all interested in it, because it's my opinions about a certain rock band. So, but somebody wanted me to make it, so I was like, yeah, might as well. And I'm considering doing this new thing where I post reels on YouTube. Just, sometimes I'll have a thought and I'm like, I'll dwell on it and I'll think about it and I'll add to it until I have like a nugget to put out there. And then that usually goes on a Facebook post, but Facebook is dying, so I might as well speak it on YouTube. God gave me these pipes for a reason.
And these guns. Before I forget, don't forget Amber's channel, When Deep Calls Deep. Go subscribe there.
Yes.
And yeah, I forgot I am doing something, Pritch. I'm slowly working on doing content that is about American Baptist theology. So priesthood of all believers and kind of our history and all that. Nothing too in-depth, but like shorter, just kind of what is an American Baptist view on priesthood, baptism, church. One video I'm excited for is called Contra Ecclesiastical Hierarchicalism. Because I'm like, that'll be clickbait for a certain subsection of our Reformed brothers and sisters, and also our Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox.
And people who are not theology people have no idea what you're talking about.
And that's
speaking of which, speaking of our Reformed brothers and sisters, Braxton released a video, 5 questions for atheists. We do this every now and then. And then Braxton and I together are going to be doing a video, 10 questions for Calvinists. So look forward to that video on Trinity Radio. And like Derek said, you can go to Theology Geek Fitness on YouTube and watch fitness and exercise videos and equipment reviews and things if you're interested in working out from home. I have full workout videos up there now, and I've got a lot of product reviews. I got a lot of tips for getting started if you got New Year's resolution. So there's that. And then I put out an interview on Trinity Radio Extra with Leighton Flowers that seems to have gotten little attention. But if you want to hear Leighton Flowers talk about everything, whether or not he can do line dancing in Texas and whether or not he grills on his, Texas barbecue and all of that in his backyard, go check out that interview. We talk about a lot of things, not just theology. So that's up there. And I've got
we need to do that on a channel. All it is what movies did you watch? What video games did you play? What music did you listen to?
Right, that's what I'm doing. So
yeah, we need to do that.
But the reason why no one's watching it, Pritchett, is your thumbnail game sucks. So we need to talk about that. It's fine. I'll help you.
Bring back Fat Pritchett. He knew how to make a thumbnail.
All right.
Just go on Twitter and ask, where should I go to make thumbnails? And then your DMs will literally explode. I found that out.
I don't care about thumbnails. I'm just telling everybody, if you're interested in what Leighton Flowers has to say about things besides Calvinism, go listen to that on Twitter.
By the way, that was
do a thumbnail that makes people interested. Golly, Pritchett.
Leighton Flowers loves soy. It's one of his favorite things to barbecue.
Look, man, I'm just going to start doing this. I will make you your thumbnail for that. I'm not even kidding.
Makes him lazy, and I
don't care. I want it to succeed.
Lean, we don't give a
No, Pritchett does too much for me. I could definitely make him thumbnails.
That's not true. We all know that's not true.
Oh, but he does.
All right. We'll see y'all next week. We're getting out of here. God bless everybody. Have a good
Go to
night.
church on Sunday.